in. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. We are AlignAI. My name is Nick Wu. I'm joined by Brendan Kelly today. And today, our Field Notes webinar is all about sustainability for models. So field notes related to MLOps. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be speaking basically the next 30 minutes on this topic, as well as taking Q&A from the audience. So if you have any questions, please submit those in the chat or the Q&A. And we would like to have a live conversation with you guys related to any questions you have related to machine learning and the operations related to it. Before we get into the meat of the conversation for today, have a few announcements we want to make, as well as an introduction to AlignAI that we'd like to cover. So we, as AlignAI, are an edtech company really focused on cross-skilling the workforce in analytics and artificial intelligence. So we do that through hands-on application in terms of labs, as well as live workshops and team collaboration coaching on projects related to helping organizations essentially accelerate the strategic initiatives they have around analytics and AI. So if you're interested in the work we do, any of the courses we offer, from the gamut of data stewardship and quality and data fluency and enablement, all the way up to courses related to this topic, like MLOps and data ops, definitely check out our website, getalignai.com, and reach out. We'd love to talk to you about what your goals are related to AI, as well as if any training could be a key enabler to that. Also, as a couple announcements, so today, this is one of our Field Notes webinar. We are doing these webinars every other Thursday at noon. So love that you joined us today. Continue to join us every other week at noon, where we put on Field Notes webinars, discussions, thought leadership conversations, as well as even debates. Yes, serious debates that we're going to start doing that we're really excited about too, related to topics in this evolving industry of AI, machine learning, analytics, and data as well. Just announced last night, we have some big news. We made it to the finals for Code Launch, and Code Launch is essentially a startup accelerator. So we are very excited to be one of the 5 teams picked out of 45 to 50 plus submissions. So we were very excited to be finalists for the Code Launch competition. And that live event in Ohio is coming up towards the end of August. So we'll see you on stage there. As well as our ebook is coming out this week related to scaling AI, where we've taken a ton of contributions from leaders in the field, just in terms of what they're seeing. So we're excited to share that knowledge with you all, as well as our July newsletter just went out. So sign up for our newsletter for the latest in terms of webinars that we're putting out, content, as well as any new thought leadership that we're getting from the field too. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and throw it over to you, Brendan Kelly, to talk through kind of your background, the topic of MLOps, kind of some of the things you're seeing in the field, as well as why you're excited to talk about this topic today. Brendan, good afternoon. Thanks for joining.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Wu. I appreciate it. My name is Brendan Kelly. I'm a co-founder here at AlignAI, specifically focused on a lot of our training, but I do spend a good amount of time consulting in the field, helping folks stand up the MLOps practice, and really help scale out their data science function and bring all those different teams together, which is going to be a exciting and interesting bit that I like to talk through is how do we get all the right people in the room? How do we align all that for where we want to go? So I'm very excited and passionate about this topic. In my background before getting into MLOps was very heavy in the DevOps and Agile world. So doing a lot of this similar, how do we make a sustainable software product? And then translating that into the world of machine learning and AI, of how do we make this sustainable, keep it integrated in the business, keep it relevant, keep it producing value and ROI for the business.
Yeah, and I think this conversation is so topical because even in the past couple of years, we've seen such a proliferation of MLOps just as a term being spoken about at different companies and across different teams as well. So as we were looking ahead to this webinar and really the topic we wanted to cover related to field notes, you have so many great insights and thoughts and ideas from what you've seen related to MLOps too. I'm excited to talk to you about it today.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's very interesting to see, like, even in the last 3 to 4 years, how quickly this field has really formed, matured. There's not only a lot more tooling available, but we're starting to notice more terminology start to align and be more consistent across organizations. And I think just a general, there's more awareness around this topic, which makes it very exciting because teams are now able to fully leverage it in order to scale that AI and ML practice.
Yeah, really a sign of maturity in the market overall, which is very exciting. Like teams are definitely getting to that more scaled AI as opposed to just enabling AI phase as well. So a little bit of intro for myself too, just for folks on the call. My name is Nick Wu, Solutions Director, really living in the product and the marketing space here at AlignAI. But really I bring a background in operational analytics. So really standing up what are key operations-based analytics, as well as communities of practice can we stand up inside of organizations. Related to MLOps as a subject, we're getting a ton of interest in data universities and AI universities that companies are looking to stand up inside of their organization as well. So we hope a lot of the conversation today inspires you to check out a lot of our courses on our site, as well as just additional chats and conversations that you want to have with us related to MLOps. And for folks on the phone today, Brendan, I wanted to quickly set the stage with you with terminology definition and alignment on that, because as you mentioned, things are changing rapidly related to machine learning in the MLOps field. So want to get kind of a level set on what is your definition of MLOps and what role do you usually play in teams working on MLOps from your experience?
Yeah, and I think what we've seen kind of the market really align on is that MLOps is focused on automating the life cycle or the various components or aspects of that model when it's deployed and made available to the business. And a lot of that does focus on the sustainability aspect of monitoring the model performance and automating a lot of those key components to be able to retrain it on demand or retrain it in a scalable, sustainable fashion, opposed to what we saw more commonplace and still is commonplace is I have a notebook, I retrain it, I send someone that or shove it into GitHub, something like that, and try to make that happen for deployment. So we see teams gaining a lot of maturity as this MLOps becomes available to be able to sustainably deploy, monitor, and scale those ML models.
And when you talk about, oh, go ahead.
As I say, my role has typically been on the outside coming into organizations to help stand this capability up. So a lot of times I'm working with the data science team who feels that pain the most directly, and then helping organize the other components in the organization, like the software engineering capabilities, the DevOps capabilities, security, governance, all those pieces. And I've worked on projects ranging from the big insurance, financials, banks, things like that, all the way through smaller startups that have more like embedded product level AI and machine learning. So it's been interesting to see kind of both ends of the spectrum and that reoccurring problem of getting the right folks in the room, having them talk through what they need, and then who's going to be taking care of which portions of this overall system.
And just getting to tactics of that, speaking to the roles and the people actually in the room, I think it would help the audience to understand what are typically the roles that you're seeing, and do those roles vary in terms of titles as well as team size in terms of when teams are working on machine learning operations and this whole sustainability aspect?
Yeah, so we still see a very large difference in how people are using the titles and leveraging them. But I would say in general, we notice that there are folks that are the data scientists who are focused really on the model development, model selection, evaluation, like really picking the best way to solve this business problem. And then there's typically a data engineer who's focused on the pipelining to get there. And then we are seeing the role of a machine learning engineer become more prevalent, which is essentially translating between those two roles. So they'll typically either be a data scientist who has more computer science or a data engineer who has a little bit more AI ML background. And they are really providing that kind of crossing the chasm between this is the model that we need to go with from a statistical perspective, and this is a production grade code asset that can now run in production. And there are a lot of other kind of auxiliary roles that need to be informed and really brought into that conversation for the design of the system, like the folks in the software engineering that it's going to integrate with, the product managers or the more business or voice of user representation to be able to say, what does the model need to be able to do? And then of course, there's also the more traditional IT, InfoSec, security, governance piece that needs to be there as well.
And I think related to that, you cannot forget about the change management aspect of getting all of these teams to collaborate in ways that they might not have before as they flip from kind of exploratory ML development to operational ML development and the support of that.
Yeah, and I think that's, especially in the enterprise, that's a large challenge, is just knowing what are all the hurdles that face me as I put my first model into production. And then even after you get your first one into production, it becomes, now we have an additional team. What is the new data set? What are the security requirements on around that? Who do we talk to? And I think that's what we notice as a large trend is if you don't get the right folks in the room up front, then when you are fully ready to go to production, you now have a 2 to 3 lead time waits for an IT ticket that you forgot about or didn't know about. So I think that has been a lot of the change management struggle, is really just knowing like who inside of the organization is going to be accountable or responsible for these pieces that I need to put together for this model in production.
And I think another interesting point that we've noticed just in the market in general is more job postings for MLOps engineers specifically. So less of that trying to blend two teams together, but also trying to find roles to live in that space as kind of the coordinators in a way, prepping for wider production and deployment.
Yeah, and I think we see teams investing in this because they know it's going to be a massive force multiplier on the impact of their data science and AI initiatives. So they know it's time to start standing up these centralized capabilities, or at least embedding folks that are more focused on this problem and how to solve it inside of the data science teams. So I think it's a very interesting time for this field too, as folks understand how to design the organization and the roles and responsibilities to be able to align to the problem.
And I think related to that, with these field notes webinars, we always try and point to tactical challenges that teams are running into, as well as recommendations that we may have related to that. So focusing on the upfront pain that you're starting to see teams run into, trying to make that transition, trying to get MLOps going. What are some of the challenges that you've seen just in general, or more specific to any certain maybe client that you've worked with, that you'd recommend considering as teams are getting this production going?
Yeah, and I think like to go back to the several projects that I've seen spanning enterprise and more of the startup world, I think the common denominator is usually more of that organizational structure, which I know folks usually don't expect, especially with something so technical as MLOps. But I do think getting the right people in the room and also driving the conversation across those different functions around what's needed. So really aligning on the requirements from each team and what they need to be able to provide with their components of this overall system for the machine learning model in production. I think that's the biggest kind of gotcha that folks struggle with, whether it's down the line security throwing a red flag on something that you're using, or if it's the software engineering team not expecting the trained model artifact the way that you're sending it to them, something along those lines. Like in general, I think that's the most important piece, is to get everybody in the same room, talking the same terminology across these various functions with a new technology like machine learning, which can be very, very difficult. So I've seen, that's where I've spent a lot of my time, is pulling up a diagram that is usually the architecture and saying like, okay, what are all the pieces that need to come together for this model? Where is the training data coming from? Where's the scoring data coming from? How are we going to fit this all together? And who's doing what by when, in order for us to be successfully making that model available in production?
And you're saying have those conversations up front as early as possible when it comes to the team actually being assembled and the use case really being defined.
Yeah, it can be very tempting to just kind of solve the next problem next, right? But having a little bit of that, for kind of prediction of where you're going to end up really helps to avoid those longer lead times, because there are a lot of kind of integration pieces that typically need to come together. And for folks that already have gone over that hurdle initially with the deployment, I think a big topic is always like model monitoring, model performance. And I think there's a similar challenge there of how are you going to quantify the overall performance of this model? And then how are we going to provide the alerting and the feedback to be able to drive that to the right place? So it's a very similar problem around who's the right person for this to go to, who can react to it appropriately. It's a similar kind of people problem in our technology system that we need to solve for.
Is there any key teams you see across the organization that are oftentimes left out in these early on conversations that you'd recommend, teams to consider bringing on earlier as part of this process?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that I've noticed, again, at that enterprise and also in the smaller kind of startups, is the software engineering team that is going to integrate with the model. So if it's going into a web app that they're utilizing, or even going into a dashboard, they typically have a lot more existing controls and standards in place, where they need to follow a DevOps, or they need to follow a change management and IT ticketing system to kind of get things and those changes into production. There's also a lot of alignment that needs to happen, and it might not really be in their roadmap. So I think that's the one that I see people stumble with the most, is where is this model going to end up? And how do I make sure we design with where it's ending up in mind, so that we don't lose sight of all those key dependencies to get it to the business?
And making sure everyone's bought into where it is going to end up. So then you have a concerted force of individuals working together, as opposed to having confusion around what is done, what does the end state look like?
Yeah, and there's a great paper from Google that we can share, or some Google engineers, and they talk about the technical debt of machine learning systems. And I think it's a great kind of overview and kind of dive into a lot of the problems that you solve in MLOps, because not only do you have a changing and evolving software system, which requires all the DevOps and Agile kind of practices as well, but then you add in the additional layers of machine learning and data and living in a dynamic system like machine learning models do. So it's not only that initial like making sure we're aligned to put it in production, it's going to do what we want it to do in production, but make sure there's the flexibility designed into the system so we can also react when the model changes or the data changes or the business use cases change, right? So a lot of that alignment takes time to kind of sort out. So it's better to start with this flexibility and this ability to adapt built into the model and to the team that's supporting that model.
And as you talk more about the relationship between MLOps and historical DevOps, I can't help but wonder, is there other bleed over in terms of practices from DevOps like agile project management when it comes to doing a lot of this coordination and really communicating expectations all along the way? What have you seen from a project management standpoint? Do you see a lot more agile applied across teams or other aspects?
Yeah, that's a great question because there's the classic debate, which is a good one of should you try to have your data science team run in sprints? And it is traditionally more like a research and development R&D function. So trying to get them to have more of this like respond to the customer small batch is, quite difficult. So I usually recommend like just waterfall through your first deployment, right? Because you got to take all these dependencies, you got timelines you need to coordinate. Like that is a classic, we know where we're trying to end up. Let's waterfall there. And then once you are there, you can reassess, should we be running more of like an agile kind of reactive approach to our project management? And in MLOps, that can look a little bit different, right? It might not be new functionality available inside of the model that you're planning and prioritizing and adjusting based on the business, but it might be more of new monitoring that you need to add in place, right? So you realize that your problem is not the model's performance itself, but it's more of drift inside of our input data, right? So by having that kind of reactive mentality, we can kind of break that down into smaller goals and then sprint through that in a more of an agile function. But it definitely is better to waterfall to the big bang release because you got to coordinate so many dependencies and get so many teams in line to be able to get there.
And do you think a lot of teams, because I'm thinking about the pre-go live but then the post-go live and the kind of sustainment that I want to talk to you about as well. We've talked a lot about the pre-go live. Any other things that you've seen related to just the proper preparation ahead of putting models in production as the pre-work before it goes live, before we flip into that other side, which is the sustainability aspect once it is in production?
Yeah, I think quality assurance is the biggest piece. So testing, because a lot of teams skip over that naturally, right? And we want to build in as much of that as possible, especially because we are working with typically a distributed architecture or a distributed system that's running through multiple pieces. Especially in the enterprise, this is very difficult because you have multiple environments that you need to move the model through to be able to meet the requirements from security and change management. So a lot of times we see people miss that, is not building in testing or automated testing, or just really the mentality of let's check everything every time before we move it up. Because they can look like simple systems because it's not like millions of lines of code potentially that's running this, but they are typically very interconnected systems. So it's important to have that testing built in that pre-go live. I think the other piece that people miss a lot, or at least we saw people stumble with a lot, was getting the right approvals to put it into production, especially if it's your first time, because you may not know what are all the reviews or all the different change management processes that your software team is working through. So it's important to kind of do that discovery up front so you can plan accordingly and know what to expect there. So.
Yeah, exactly. Especially that is very true with full-time employees if everything is in-house, but also with third-party contractors if you're leveraging any external data sources to support a lot of this as well. The constant communication, make sure that they're on board too. It's got to be key.
Yeah, and to kind of speak to that post-go live and sustainability as well, a lot of those tests that you do on the way to production can also be leveraged in production itself. So like the evaluation that you do at the end of training can be something that you keep an eye on as it's in production as well, whereas you're doing automated retraining jobs to be able to kind of get more insights for cheaper, if you will, if you can build some into that training pipeline. There's also the ability once you're in production to just be able to rely on that model more because it has been tested on the way to production. So that also helps with that sustainability aspect. But when it comes to sustainability post kind of launch, it all comes down to monitoring, which is a big challenge that I've seen a lot of teams trying to unlock. They get their initial models deployed, and then very quickly it becomes, okay, how do we monitor this in production? So that can be another whole pipeline that also requires some more data capture, again, from that software engineering team that we want to work with closely, to be able to see what were the predictions in production for that model version. And then it opens up a whole another can of worm of what is a model version? How do we know which one did well? and then keeping track of that in the various environments as well, because there might be multiple experiments that we're running. And so we want to like be able to understand those performance of them on the way to production, but also as they are in production and we promote them live.
Which sounds like a ton of documentation. And that leads to my next question, which is how do you see teams succeeding in not over documenting, but still putting together enough that's evergreen documentation to continue to revisit and saving themselves time in the future?
Yes, I spend a lot of time on documentation. And I think my general thought process with documentation is to avoid over documenting, especially you typically document the first version of the process that you're rolling out. So it's hard to keep that live once it's in production, or like once you've gone through the first set of learnings, because then you do it again and you learn a whole new approach and a much better way to do it typically, right? So I think it's important to not over document up front. But my rule of thumb is if somebody requests documentation, or if I know I need to do a guide or I need to like walk through something, like I got a request this morning for more clarity on roles and responsibilities and how to onboard new models, right? So as soon as that comes in, I'll prioritize it, and that, you know, makes it valuable to make sure that people are actually going to read it. That's a classic problem with documentation as well. But in general, I'd say hold off until you have a pretty clear idea of what that process is going to look like after a couple reps through it, and then, you know, invest the time to make sure the team knows where they are. I think it's also really important to leverage training very much of these rollouts. I think that's a piece that teams also slip up on a lot. Because again, we have a very cross-functional team that's doing MLOps. So we need to clarify, like, what are the roles we're talking about? Who's doing what is that component that we're talking about? Like, what is a training pipeline for this model? What does that look like for maybe a computer vision use case, if that's what your team is utilizing? So I think it's really important too to have that live training that's customized to the process that they'll live in to work through as well. So I'd almost say training over documentation, especially if you have folks who are more senior, they can help kind of upskill your more newer team members, right? And kind of walk through how they've done it. That's been a huge value add as well. And obviously that's informs a lot of how we train and why we train the way we do, is to not only introduce these concepts, show them the process, understand kind of that theory, but also walk them through real use cases of like, this is what a pipeline is, this is what the pipeline does, this is how we used it for this use case. Like, here's a real world example to help anchor that theory into your practice of what you're going to be doing in a day-to-day kind of function.
That's really, really good. And that actually, we got a Q&A question from the audience related to that, specific to the tools. So the question is, you know, what are some of the tools you use or you've seen teams use to get a clear picture of a process without documentation? Like trying to visualize without making it too much extra work for the team, essentially related to the process. Is that possible? What tools do you see related to that?
Oh, that's a great question. So I've typically, when I'm doing documentation, I guess if we're trying to do it without documentation, I typically leverage lucid charts and do like diagrams and lay that out. I feel like that's kind of like the whiteboard, especially working with remote teams, as many of us do. It's good to be able to have that. And then you can also reference back to it. Those are typically more messy and they evolve with the team. And then I will take that and put it into Confluence or more of that traditional documentation. The ability to articulate the process, though, I think ultimately comes down to how we do our automation. So I think a lot of the way you can avoid documentation is just having well-documented code. So being able to point to a notebook for where the model was developed, and then being able to point to like a training pipeline that takes that model all the way through, because that's usually where engineers are living and breathing. So it's a lot easier for me to go to a new data engineer and say, hey, this is how we built that pipeline, you know, take a look at that. That can help avoid more of the text-based stuff that goes stale and have well-documented code that shows that process or how that data gets processed. And then there also are tools. So I used to work at a company called MLOps, and we built a tool that was focused on more than MLOps and like governance kind of aspect of MLOps, but it also had a lot of the business process automated inside of it. So there are like BPM or business process management tools that automate a lot of that. And they can handle like running jobs, approvals, et cetera, et cetera. You can also leverage more traditional like data pipeline orchestration tools that can represent that in a more functional way to show like an Airflow DAG that shows how models get retrained or something along those lines to help avoid that text-based documentation as well. So long answer there. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, and it seems like just starting with a Lucid, which is a virtual version of a whiteboard, essentially, to talk through step one, this happens, and then it goes to step two, and then it goes to step three. Really starting simple with a whiteboard tool like Lucid, and then formalizing that with What are some of the next software bits that teams use after the Lucid whiteboard is down, you think, to start to maybe do a clean slate documentation of a process for the first time?
Yeah, I think typically we see them start in Lucid and then they might move it into like their project management tool. So like a Jira or something else to represent that, especially the handoff portions as typically done in more of that project management tool. And then I think from there, it might go into a more advanced like enterprise one, such as like a business process tool. So like Camunda is used commonly for that. And that will do kind of that automation on top of that documentation. Similar to like an Airflow DAG for more of that data pipelining kind of style of automation. And then you have like the visual representation of what steps it goes through, which people can utilize to understand where that goes downstream of them.
And I also we want to bring up, we see a lot of teams do a current state, future state. And so here is current state today. And if we have on our roadmap any enhancements to the overall process or any changes to this tech stack that we're going to make, like here's a potential future state as part of a road mapping exercise of where we'd like to get to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think another key aspect is to track it in your project management tool. So like if you're using a Jira or something along those lines, making sure that you have that to account for the capacity to be able to work on more of these future state ideas. Because a lot of times teams, especially as they're standing up these new capabilities, they're rushing to get something out the door. They recognize additional opportunities to do better next time, but they rarely get the prioritization in the business conversation to be able to say, hey, we need to pay down some technical debt based on how we're doing authentication or how we're doing this thing right now. Let's go ahead and spend part of my next sprint focusing on this. So I think that's also important for engineers to kind of help allocate their capacity to those things and make sure that they have that in their capacity planning or project management tool to account for that.
That's really good. It makes a ton of sense. And I think you've communicated a ton of real world tactics that teams are doing, which is super helpful. And just with the few minutes we have remaining, I want to bring it up a level to industry wide. What do you see as the next step for most teams in MLOps? As you're getting exposure to all these different teams, any high level directional things you see teams working on is what's next for them?
Yeah, I think the major pressure that we're feeling for how people are advancing the capability is definitely around monitoring. That has been, the classic, not a classic holy grail, but a thing that a lot of teams aspire to. And they're typically working through the deployment piece because that's, the step one. And then that monitoring, whether that's on the performance of the model, the state of the data pipeline that's coming into the model itself, things that are more on like the ethical bias governance aspects. In general, I think that is the next big topic that we're seeing a lot of teams working on, is what does the business need to see? How do we build in the sustainability around this model? How do we capture that? How do we prioritize from all the different things we could monitor? Like what is the most important for us to focus on? So I think that is the most like kind of technical area that we're seeing teams focus on. And then at a kind of market level of what we're seeing, I think the organizational structure is going to be the most interesting next kind of piece, because typically it will start off with like a data scientist managing this, right? And then a data engineer comes in the picture and starts helping them. And then eventually that data engineer kind of evolves, or that data scientist kind of evolves into more of a traditional machine learning engineer. But I think there's a lot of good conversations around how do you stand up a centralized capability around this, right? Like a dedicated MLOps team. And do they report to more of the data science function, or do they report more to the IT function? So I think eventually we'll see that shift more and more over to the IT architecture ops realm. But I think teams are still kind of pushing the automation and the maturity to be able to get ready to do that, so that their data scientists can focus more on modeling and then hand it off to this function to be fully deployed and scaled.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And just as we're wrapping up, I'm going to ask you one more question, Brendan. It's more of a personal, what excites you about what's next, but want to mention to folks while we're talking about it, these MLOps capabilities that teams are working to build out, we're seeing a ton of it. And we put on courses for MLOps and ML engineering, as well as data ops and data engineering. So check us out at AlignAI if you'd like to learn more about the courses we offer. And Brendan, just as a final note, as a question to you, what are personally some of the most exciting or interesting areas in MLOps that you look forward to, or any books that you're reading related to the topic as well that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting thought leadership, and I find it so this new concept of like, how do we bring the representation of the business and the user into more of this modeling and development aspects, similar to like product management in software and product design in software. So that part really interests me a lot. Like, what do we need to know to be able to trust this model? I think that's where monitoring is also really interesting, because it's not just here's your prediction, go make a decision. It's also how do we understand and quantify what this model is really doing out there in the field. And I think overall, machine learning and AI is just such a massive opportunity to automate a lot of low-level tasks that human beings are way too smart to be doing. So I'm very excited to see additional use cases around automating things like reading form documentation or scanning in images to automate even complex manufacturing processes. Things like that to me are just always very exciting, and it's great to be able to play a role around helping teams align around it, and then also understand what is the best practices or best ways to go about making this a reality for the AI and the ML.
Well put. And it's been a pleasure today, Brendan. Thank you for your time. Brilliant conversation as always. Any folks on the call, if you have remaining questions afterwards, please reach out to us at info@getalignai.com or check out our website, getalignai.com as well. We will see you on the next webinar every other Thursday at noon. So not this next Thursday, but the following Thursday. We will see you for the next one. Thank you everybody for joining. We'll talk to you soon.
Yep. Thank you very much.
You guys.